The blazing heat of the Arizona Territory sun beat down on Eleanor Fairfield's cabin as she swept the last of the dust from her modest porch, unaware that miles away, 5 men were planning to reduce her life to ashes. It was 1878, 3 years since she had claimed this parcel of land after her father's death, and 2 years since most folks had stopped questioning whether a woman of 22 could manage a homestead alone. Eleanor wiped sweat from her brow and gazed across the scrubby landscape that stretched toward distant mountains. The land was harsh but beautiful, much like the life she had carved out for herself. Her small vegetable garden showed signs of thriving despite the unforgiving climate, and her 2 milk cows grazed contentedly in the nearby pen. She had plans to ride into town the following day for supplies, but for now, as the afternoon waned, she needed to finish her chores. The water barrel needed filling, and she still had mending to do before darkness fell. Eleanor's life followed a predictable rhythm wake at dawn: tend to animals, work the garden, maintain the cabin, sleep, and begin again. Some might have found it lonely, but after escaping an arranged marriage to a man 30 years her senior, Eleanor treasured her independence. 20 miles away, in the ramshackle mining town of Devil's Gulch, Matthew Irwin knocked back the last of his whiskey and pushed away from the bar. At 30, he'd spent half his life drifting across the frontier, taking work where he could find it sometimes as a ranch hand, occasionally as a scout for the cavalry, and most recently as a deputy in towns too small to attract more qualified lawmen. "Leaving already, Irwin?" called the bartender. "Night's just getting started." Matthew adjusted his worn leather hat. "Got an early ride tomorrow, taking supplies out to the Fairfield place." The bartender's expression darkened. That stubborn woman still out there alone? Surprised the Apache or Outlaws haven't gotten to her yet. "She can handle herself," Matthew replied, having delivered goods to Eleanor's homestead several times in the past few months. Their interactions had been brief, but enough for him to develop a quiet admiration for her determination. As Matthew stepped onto the boardwalk, he noticed 5 riders gathered at the far end of the street. Even from a distance, he recognized Jesse Blackburn and his gang troublemakers who'd been terrorizing smaller settlements throughout the territory. The group had been drinking heavily, their laughter carrying down the dusty street as they mounted their horses. Something in their demeanor raised the hairs on the back of Matthew's neck. He'd learned to trust that instinct during his years on the frontier. Moving casually, he approached his bay gelding hitched outside the general store and pretended to adjust his saddle while straining to hear their conversation. "Teach that uppity woman a lesson," Blackburn's voice carried on the evening breeze. "That homestead sits on prime water access. Once she's gone, we can claim it easy." "What if she won't sell?" asked one of his companions. Blackburn's laugh was cold. "Who said anything about selling? Fire has a way of changing circumstances. By morning, that land will be up for grabs." A chill ran down Matthew's spine. There was only one woman homesteader in the immediate area, Eleanor Fairfield. Without drawing attention to himself, Matthew mounted his horse and headed in the opposite direction from the gang. Once out of sight, he urged his horse into a gallop, cutting cross-country toward Eleanor's cabin. The Outlaws would likely follow the main trail, which would give him perhaps a half-hour head start if he pushed his mount hard. The sun had set by the time Eleanor finished her evening chores. She sat by the light of a kerosene lamp, mending a tear in her only good dress. Tomorrow's trip to town was a monthly necessity, but also a welcome break from isolation. She looked forward to exchanging pleasantries with Mrs. Holbrook at the general store, and perhaps hearing news from beyond her small corner of the territory. A noise outside startled her horses approaching at speed. Visitors rarely came at night, especially unannounced. Cautiously, Eleanor reached for the rifle that hung above the door. Years alone had taught her that preparedness wasn't paranoia. It was survival. Before she could retrieve the weapon, the cabin door burst open. Matthew Irwin stood in the doorway, hat in hand, breathing heavily. "Mr. Irwin?" "What?" "Miss Fairfield, you need to gather whatever you can carry. Blackburn's gang is headed this way." His voice was urgent but steady. "They mean to burn you out." Eleanor's heart raced. "Burn me out? Why would they? Your water rights, land, doesn't matter. They're coming, and they're armed." Matthew glanced out the window into the darkness. "We have minutes, not hours." Eleanor had heard of Jesse Blackburn most people in the territory had. His gang had burned out 3 homesteaders in the past year, leaving 2 dead and 1 family fleeing back east with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Without further questions, Eleanor grabbed a canvas bag and began stuffing it with essentials: a change of clothes, the small box containing her father's watch and her mother's wedding ring, the pouch of coins she kept hidden in a hollowed-out Bible. "Where can we go?" she asked, her mind racing through options. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and the town was a half-day's ride. "I know a place," Matthew replied, helping her gather supplies. "An old line shack about 8 miles north. It's not much, but it's defensible, and Blackburn's boys won't know to look there." As Eleanor secured the last of her precious possessions, a sound outside froze them both, multiple horses approaching, men's voices carrying through the night. "Back door," Matthew whispered, extinguishing the lamp. They slipped out the rear of the cabin into the cool desert night. Matthew's horse stood tethered to a post, but there was no time to ready Eleanor's mount. "We'll have to double up," Matthew said, helping her onto his gelding before swinging up behind her. "Hold tight." They rode away from the cabin just as shouts erupted from the front. Through the darkness, Eleanor could make out the silhouettes of riders dismounting, their voices growing louder and more aggressive. "Where's that woman?" someone yelled, followed by the sound of a door being kicked open. Matthew guided his horse through a narrow wash, away from the cabin and the main trail. They'd gone perhaps a quarter mile when Eleanor gasped. Looking back, she saw the first flicker of flames illuminating her home. "They're burning it," she whispered, her voice tight with shock. "Everything I've worked for." "I'm sorry," Matthew said simply, his voice low in her ear as they continued riding. "We'll figure something out. But right now, we need distance." The fire spread quickly through the dry timber of the cabin. Within minutes, the entire structure was engulfed, a beacon of destruction visible for miles across the dark desert. Eleanor watched over her shoulder as her life turned to ash, her throat tight with unshed tears. Behind them, angry voices rose over the roar of the flames. "Someone's been here recently," a man's voice carried across the desert. "The horses are still warm in the pen." "Find her," another voice, undoubtedly Blackburn's, commanded. "She can't have gone far." "They'll search the main trails," Matthew said quietly. "We're heading cross-country." For the next hour, they picked their way carefully through the desert, Matthew guiding his horse around cactus and through dry washes, avoiding open ground whenever possible. The moon had risen, providing just enough light to navigate, but also increasing the risk of being spotted if Blackburn's men fanned out in pursuit. Eleanor sat rigidly in front of Matthew, her back pressed against his chest, her hands clutching the saddle horn. The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. Her home was gone. Her animals, if not stolen, would scatter or fall prey to predators. 3 years of independence and hard work had vanished in minutes. "Why did you come?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible above the steady rhythm of hoofbeats. Matthew was silent for a moment. "I overheard them planning in town. Couldn't let 'em hurt you. You risked yourself for a woman you barely know." He shifted slightly in the saddle. "I know enough. I know you're brave, determined, too stubborn to ask for help when you need it." Despite everything, Eleanor felt a faint smile touch her lips. "That sounds like criticism, Mr. Irwin." "Just observation, Miss Fairfield." There was warmth in his voice that hadn't been there before. The line shack appeared as a dark outline against the starry sky, a simple structure built to house cowboys during seasonal cattle drives. It had been abandoned for at least a season, judging by the undisturbed dirt around its entrance, but the roof was intact and the walls solid. Matthew dismounted and helped Eleanor down, her legs unsteady after the long ride. He led his horse to a small lean-to at the rear of the shack, then checked the interior, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. "It's clear," he said, returning to where Eleanor stood clutching her small bag of possessions. "Not exactly comfortable, but it'll do until we figure out our next move." Inside, the shack contained little more than a crude table, 2 stools, a wood stove, and a narrow cot. Matthew lit a lantern he found on a shelf, revealing walls lined with basic supplies: coffee, beans, flour, and ammunition left by whoever had last used the place. "Cowboys keep these shacks stocked," he explained. "Unwritten rule of the territory. What you take, you replace next time through." Eleanor sank onto one of the stools, the events of the evening finally overwhelming her. Her shoulders began to shake with silent sobs. Matthew stood awkwardly for a moment before sitting beside her. "I truly am sorry about your place." "It's not just the cabin," she managed between breaths. "It's everything it represented. My independence, my choice to live as I wanted, not as someone else dictated." Matthew nodded, understanding in his eyes. "My father had my whole life planned from birth which ranch I'd run, which neighbor's daughter I'd marry. I rode out at 16 and never looked back." Eleanor wiped her eyes. "So we're both refugees from other people's expectations." "I suppose we are." He stood and moved to the stove. "I'll get a fire going. Nights get cold out here, even in summer." As Matthew busied himself with practical matters, building a fire, preparing a simple meal from the shack's supplies, bringing water from a nearby spring, Eleanor's thoughts whirled. In a single night, everything had changed. She had no home, few possessions, and found herself dependent on a man she knew only through brief encounters in town. Yet there was something about Matthew Irwin that inspired trust. Perhaps it was the lack of pity in his eyes when he looked at her, or the matter-of-fact way he had ridden into danger to warn her. He treated her not as a helpless woman, but as a person worthy of respect, a rarity in her experience. They ate a simple meal of beans and hardtack in companionable silence. After, Matthew insisted she take the cot while he made a bedroll on the floor. "What happens tomorrow?" Eleanor asked as she settled onto the narrow bed. Matthew stared into the dying embers in the stove. "We should wait a day or two, make sure Blackburn's gang has moved on. Then I'll take you into town. The sheriff there is a good man. He'll help you file a complaint." "A complaint won't rebuild my home or replace my animals." "No," Matthew agreed, "but it's a start, and I've got some savings. It's not much, but enough to get you situated somewhere." Eleanor sat up, surprised. "Why would you do that?" In the dim light, She saw color rise in his cheeks. Because it's the right thing to do. Mr. Irwin. Matthew, he corrected. Think we're past formalities. Matthew, then. I appreciate your offer, but I won't take your money. He smiled slightly. Stubborn, like I said. Eleanor lay back down, pulling the rough blanket around her shoulders. I prefer to call it self-reliant. Dawn filtered through the single window of the line shack, rousing Eleanor from a fitful sleep. For a moment, confusion clouded her mind before memory rushed back the warning, the flight, the fire consuming everything she owned. Matthew was already awake, moving quietly as he rekindled the fire in the stove. He looked up when she stirred. Morning, he said simply. Coffee's almost ready. Eleanor sat up, smoothing her rumpled dress. Thank you. For everything. He nodded, acknowledging her gratitude without requiring more words. It was a quality Eleanor appreciated. Matthew didn't fill silence with needless conversation. They shared coffee and the last of the previous night's beans, discussing their next steps. Matthew would scout the area later that morning, ensuring Blackburn's gang had moved on. If it seemed safe, they would begin the journey to town the following day. What will you do after? Matthew asked, his eyes meeting hers over the rim of his tin cup. Eleanor had been pondering that very question all night. I don't know, she admitted. I have a little money saved, but not enough to rebuild or start over somewhere else. You have family back east? She shook her head. No one. My mother died when I was young, and my father brought me west when I was 16. He died 3 years ago. Matthew studied her for a moment. I've been thinking about your water rights. That's valuable in this territory, may be valuable enough to leverage into a new start. How so? You still own the land, even if the cabin's gone. You could sell those rights to one of the larger ranches. Carson's outfit to the south would pay well for guaranteed water access. Eleanor considered this. The idea of selling felt like admitting defeat, yet Matthew was right. Water rights in the arid territory represented her most valuable asset. I'll think about it, she conceded. While Matthew scouted, Eleanor took stock of the line shack's supplies, organizing what they had and making a mental list of what they needed. It gave her hands purpose while her mind worked through possibilities for her future. By midday, when Matthew returned, she had swept the dirt floor, repaired a broken stool, and even discovered a small garden plot behind the shack where wild onions still grew. All clear, he reported, removing his hat as he entered. No sign of Blackburn or his men. They've likely moved on to their next target. Or they're waiting in town, Eleanor said grimly. Matthew nodded. Possible, but they'll expect you to have fled the territory. They won't anticipate you coming back to file a complaint. What good will a complaint do against men like that? On its own, not much, Matthew admitted, but enough complaints from enough people, and eventually even territorial law will have to respond. Eleanor sighed, knowing he was right, but finding little comfort in the slow wheels of justice. I should check on my land tomorrow, see what's left. Matthew hesitated, concern evident in his expression. It might be better to wait, give things time to settle. They've taken my home, Matthew. I won't let them chase me away from what's mine. Her voice was firm. Besides, my animals might have survived. I can't abandon them. Seeing her determination, Matthew nodded. We'll go together then, but we approach carefully. The next morning dawned clear and cool. They set out at first light, Matthew's bay carrying them both as they retraced their path toward Eleanor's homestead. As they rode, Matthew shared stories of his years drifting across the West, working cattle drives in Texas, mining in Colorado, even a brief stint as an Army scout during campaigns against the Apache. Eleanor found herself drawn to his tales, particularly his descriptions of the landscapes he'd traversed. There was poetry in how Matthew spoke of mountain ranges and vast prairies, revealing a sensitivity she hadn't expected from a man who wore a gun with such easy familiarity. "You've seen so much," she remarked as they paused to rest the horse. "What made you stop in this territory?" Matthew gazed across the expanse of desert, squinting against the morning sun. "I got tired of not belonging anywhere. Wanted to put down roots before I turned 30. He glanced at her. "Bought a small piece of land north of town last year. Been building a house when I'm not working odd jobs." This surprised Eleanor. In their limited previous encounters, she'd assumed Matthew was just another drifter passing through. The knowledge that he had chosen to settle in the same area shifted something in her perception of him. "Is that why you became a deputy? To belong?" He smiled slightly. "That was more circumstance than choice. Sheriff Tillman needed help during a cattle dispute last fall. Found I had a knack for keeping peace without drawing my weapon." As they drew closer to Eleanor's property, their conversation faded. Tension replaced the easy exchange of earlier miles. Matthew's posture grew alert, his eyes constantly scanning the landscape for signs of danger. When they crested the final rise overlooking her land, Eleanor gasped. Where her cabin had stood was now a blackened rectangle of ash and collapsed timbers. The corral fence was partially burned, and her vegetable garden trampled by horses. "Oh," she whispered, the single syllable containing volumes of loss. Matthew placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry." They approached cautiously, Matthew's hand never straying far from his revolver. But the homestead was deserted, the outlaws long gone. To Eleanor's relief, one of her milk cows had survived, along with a few chickens that had scattered into the surrounding brush. Dismounting, she moved through the ruins of her life. Little remained of the cabin's contents: iron cookware, the frame of her bed, a few tools too sturdy to burn. She knelt beside the ashes, sifting through them uselessly, knowing nothing of value would have survived the inferno. "We should round up your animals," Matthew suggested gently. "Take them to town when we go, at least save what we can." Eleanor nodded numbly. Together, they managed to corral the surviving cow and 5 chickens. Matthew fashioned a makeshift crate for the chickens and secured it to his saddle, while the cow would have to be led on a rope. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor stood for a long moment staring at the ruins of her cabin. 3 years of independence reduced to ash. Yet beneath her grief, another emotion was taking root: determination. She would not let Jesse Blackburn win so easily. "I'm coming back," she said quietly. "Maybe not tomorrow or next week, but I'm coming back." Matthew, leading his horse, stopped beside her. "It won't be safe until Blackburn's dealt with." She met his gaze. "Then we'll have to deal with him." Something in her expression must have convinced him of her resolve, for he didn't argue further. Instead, he simply nodded. "Yes, madam, I believe we will." The journey to town was slow with the cow in tow, and they didn't arrive until late afternoon. Devil's Gulch consisted of one main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a general store, saloon, blacksmith, small hotel, and the sheriff's office. Residents and visitors alike turned to stare at the unlikely procession: Matthew Irwin, the occasional deputy, leading a cow, followed by Eleanor Fairfield, her dress smoke stained and her expression grim. They went directly to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Tillman, a weathered man in his 50s with a silver mustache, listened gravely as they recounted the events of the past 2 days. "Blackburn's getting bolder," he said when they finished. "Used to stick to robbing stagecoaches and lonely travelers. Burning out homesteaders is escalating things." "What can be done?" Eleanor asked. The sheriff sighed. "I can file your complaint, send a wire to the federal marshal in Tucson. But I won't lie to you, Miss Fairfield. The territorial justice system moves slowly, especially for property crimes where no one was killed." "They meant to kill her," Matthew pointed out. "If I hadn't warned her, Eleanor would have been in that cabin when they torched it." Sheriff Tillman nodded soberly. "That's attempted murder, and that I can act on more directly. But I'd need proof." "The word of a deputy isn't enough?" Matthew's voice held an edge. "You're a part-time deputy at best, Irwin, and you didn't actually see them set the fire, did you? Just overheard them planning it." Eleanor intervened before Matthew could argue further. "What about my animals and belongings? Is there somewhere I can keep them until I decide my next steps?" The sheriff's expression softened. "Miller at the livery will take the cow. As for you, Mrs. Holbrook at the boarding house has a spare room. She'll likely let you work for your keep if money's tight." After filing the formal complaint, Matthew helped Eleanor settle her cow at the livery stable and arrange accommodations at the boarding house. Mrs. Holbrook, a kindly widow who had known Eleanor's father, was horrified by her story and immediately offered not just a room but a bath and clean clothes. "You'll stay as long as you need," she insisted, patting Eleanor's hand. "These outlaws are a plague on decent folk. It's not right what happened to you." Later that evening, bathed and wearing a borrowed dress, Eleanor sat on the boarding house porch with Matthew. The quiet streets of Devil's Gulch seemed a world away from the terror of 2 nights before, yet Eleanor couldn't shake her unease. "Blackburn and his men could ride into town tomorrow and the sheriff wouldn't have enough proof to arrest them," she said, breaking a long silence. Matthew nodded. "That's the way of it out here. Unless they're caught in the act or someone turns witness against them. How many others will lose their homes before justice catches up to them?" "Hard to say." Matthew leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "But I've been thinking. You mentioned selling your water rights. Carson would pay well, like I said. But there's another option." Eleanor turned to him curious. "What's that?" "My land has good soil, but poor water access. Your land has the opposite problem, rocky soil, but excellent water." He hesitated, then continued. "We could combine our assets, form a partnership." "A partnership?" Eleanor repeated, uncertain of his meaning. Matthew met her eyes directly. "I'm proposing a business arrangement. My land and labor, your water rights. We build on my property, run cattle on yours, split the profits equally." Eleanor studied him in the fading light. "That's a generous offer for water rights alone." "It's not just the water," he said quietly. "In 2 days, I've seen how capable you are, how resilient. That's worth as much as any natural resource." The compliment warmed her, but caution tempered her response. "I value my independence, Matthew. It's why I stayed on that homestead alone for 3 years." "I'm not suggesting you give that up. Equal partners, Eleanor. Your decision's carrying the same weight as mine." He smiled slightly. "And my house has 2 rooms. You'd have your own space." The proposal was unexpected, but not unwelcome. Eleanor had few options. Her savings wouldn't stretch to rebuilding, and working as Mrs. Holbrook's helper offered survival, but little prospect for regaining what she'd lost. "I'd need to see your land first," she said finally, "and we'd need a written agreement." Matthew's smile widened. "Of course. First thing tomorrow I'll show you the place. As for an agreement, we can have Simmons the notary draw something up." They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell completely over the small town. For the first time since fleeing his burning cabin, Eleanor felt a glimmer of hope for her future. Morning brought clarity and renewed purpose. After breakfast at the boarding house, Eleanor and Matthew rode north out of town. His bay carried them both again, a situation that Eleanor found herself minding less than she might have expected. There was comfort in the solid presence of Matthew behind her, his arms reaching around to hold the reins. His land lay about 5 miles from town, a parcel of good grazing land with a natural depression that could become a stock pond with proper damming. The house he'd mentioned was still in progress, a solid foundation and frame with walls that needed completing. "It's not much yet," Matthew said as they dismounted, "but by winter it will be tight against the cold." Eleanor walked the boundaries of the property, noting its advantages and challenges. The soil was indeed good, already supporting native grasses that cattle would thrive on. A stand of cottonwoods marked where groundwater ran close to the surface, though not in quantities sufficient for a growing herd. The house itself was simple but well-planned, a main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area, and 2 bedrooms separated by a short hallway. Matthew had clearly put thought into its design. "You've done good work here," she said, running her hand along a smooth, plain door frame. "Thank you." His voice held pride tempered with modesty. "Another month of solid work and it will be habitable." Eleanor stepped back outside, considering the proposal from all angles. It made practical sense. Combining their resources would give them both a better chance at prosperity than either would have alone. Yet doubts lingered. "What happens if one of us wants to marry someday?" she asked bluntly. Matthew looked startled by the question. "I hadn't considered that. I suppose we'd need to dissolve the partnership or renegotiate terms. And if Blackburn's gang returns, my association with this property could bring trouble to your doorstep." His expression hardened. "Blackburn needs dealing with regardless, and 2 people defending a home stand a better chance than 1. By the time they returned to town, Eleanor had made her decision. The partnership offered her best hope for rebuilding her life without surrendering her independence. They visited the notary that afternoon, drawing up an agreement that protected both their interests while establishing the framework for their business arrangement. News of their partnership spread quickly through the small community. Some reacted with approval, seeing the practical advantages. Others viewed the arrangement with suspicion. An unmarried man and woman living on the same property challenged frontier propriety, even with separate rooms and a business contract. Mrs. Holbrook pulled Eleanor aside after dinner. "I don't mean to pry, dear, but are you certain about this arrangement with Mr. Irwin? People will talk." "Let them talk," Eleanor replied with more confidence than she felt. "This is a business decision, nothing more." The older woman patted her hand. "Of course, dear. And Mr. Irwin seems a decent sort. Just be careful with your reputation." Over the next weeks, Eleanor and Matthew fell into a rhythm of work and planning. During the day, they focused on completing his house and preparing for cattle that would arrive with the autumn drives. In the evenings, they developed strategies for improving both properties and defending against possible return of Blackburn's gang. Eleanor found unexpected satisfaction in their partnership. Matthew worked with quiet competence, never dismissing her ideas or treating her as less capable because of her gender. Their different skills complemented each other. She had a keen eye for household management and garden planning, while he excelled at construction and animal husbandry. As August gave way to September, the house neared completion. Together they installed windows, hung doors, and chinked the logs against coming winter winds. The work was exhausting but rewarding, each day bringing visible progress. One evening, as they sat on the newly finished porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky, Eleanor felt a contentment she hadn't experienced since before her father's death. Despite losing her cabin, she had gained something unexpected, a partnership based on mutual respect. "I never asked why you didn't marry," she said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Most men your age in the territory have wives." Matthew contemplated the question before answering. "Never met a woman who wanted the same things I did. Most were looking for security, a provider. I wanted a partner." He glanced at her. "What about you? You mentioned escaping an arranged marriage." Eleanor nodded. "My father's business partner had a son. The merger made sense to everyone except me." She smiled ruefully. "I was 18 when father brought me west. By 20, I'd convinced him to let me prove myself on the homestead. When he died, I stayed on alone rather than return east to a life I didn't choose. Brave decision. Or foolish. Look where it led." Matthew's hand covered hers briefly. "To here. Not such a bad outcome considering." The simple touch sent warmth spreading up her arm. Eleanor found herself increasingly aware of Matthew as more than a business partner, the way sunlight caught in his dark hair, the crinkles at the corners of his eyes when he smiled, the quiet strength in his hands as they worked together. Such awareness was dangerous, she knew. Their arrangement depended on maintaining professional boundaries, yet she couldn't deny the growing connection between them, one that transcended mere convenience or necessity. October brought cooler temperatures and increased activity in the territory. Cattle drives passed through on their way to southern markets, bringing with them cowboys eager to spend wages in town. The influx of visitors made Eleanor nervous. More people meant more opportunities for news of Blackburn's gang. Her fears proved justified when Sheriff Tillman rode out to their property one crisp morning. He dismounted heavily, his expression grim. "Blackburn's back," he announced without preamble. "Hit the Zimmerman place yesterday, took their cattle and burned their barn." Matthew's jaw tightened. "Anyone hurt?" "Zimmerman took a bullet in the shoulder. He'll live, but it was a close thing." The sheriff looked at Eleanor. "Thought you should know, considering your history with them." "Did Zimmerman identify Blackburn specifically?" Matthew asked. The sheriff nodded. "Got a good look at him." "Signed a statement this morning." "That's your proof then," Eleanor said. "Enough to arrest him if he comes to town." "If I catch him in town," the sheriff corrected, "and if I can gather enough men to back me. Blackburn rides with 4 others, all armed and mean as rattlesnakes." After the sheriff departed, Matthew and Eleanor discussed their options. The news of Blackburn's return changed their calculations. Completing the house now took on greater urgency. "We should be ready to move in by next week," Matthew decided. "It's not perfect, but it's defensible." "I'll go to town tomorrow," Eleanor said. "Get the last supplies we need while you finish the roof." That night, unable to sleep at the boarding house, Eleanor sat by her window watching the quiet street below. The knowledge that Blackburn was in the area again made her stomach twist with anxiety. Would he seek her out specifically, angry that she had escaped his first attempt? Or was burning her cabin simply business, now completed and forgotten? Either way, she refused to live in fear. The partnership with Matthew had given her more than just practical advantages. It had restored her sense of purpose. Together, they were building something worthwhile, something that belonged to both of them equally. She would not allow Jesse Blackburn to take that from her, too. The following day, Eleanor completed her errands in town efficiently, purchasing supplies they would need for the move to the new house. As she left the general store, arms loaded with packages, a voice called her name. "Miss Fairfield, a moment of your time." She turned to see Albert Carson, owner of the largest cattle operation in the area, approaching across the street. In his 60s, with a silver beard and expensive clothes, Carson represented old money and influence in the territory. "Mr. Carson," she acknowledged with a nod. "What can I do for you?" "I heard about your misfortune," he said, his tone sympathetic, though his eyes remained calculating. "A terrible business with Blackburn's gang. I also understand you've entered a partnership with young Irwin." Eleanor shifted her packages. "News travels fast." "Small communities," Carson replied with a thin smile. "I wanted to make you an offer. Your water rights are valuable, more valuable than whatever arrangement you have with Irwin. I'm prepared to pay $5,000 for clear title. Enough for you to return east in comfort." The sum was substantial, more than Eleanor had expected, yet the offer rankled. "I appreciate your interest, Mr. Carson, but I've already committed to my partnership with Mr. Irwin." Carson's expression hardened slightly. "Reconsider, Miss Fairfield. Irwin's land is marginal at best, and with Blackburn targeting homesteaders, your position is precarious." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Carson?" "Warning you," he corrected smoothly. "This territory can be dangerous for those without proper connections." With that parting comment, he tipped his hat and departed, leaving Eleanor with an unsettled feeling. The encounter seemed more than a simple business proposition. There was something in Carson's manner that suggested he knew more about Blackburn's activities than he should. When she related the conversation to Matthew that evening, his reaction confirmed her suspicions. "Carson's wanted that water for years," he said, pacing the boarding house porch. "Your father refused to sell, and then you did the same. The timing of Blackburn's attack on your cabin and now Carson's offer is too convenient." "You think Carson is behind Blackburn's gang?" Matthew considered. "Not directly, perhaps, but using them? Paying them to clear obstacles? It fits with other patterns in the territory." "We need proof before making such accusations," Eleanor cautioned. "Carson has influence with territorial officials." "Agreed." Matthew sat beside her. "But it gives us something to watch for. And another reason to be cautious." The following week passed in a flurry of activity as they completed preparations for moving to the new house. With Carson's potential connection to Blackburn now a concern, they worked with renewed urgency, often continuing by lantern light after sunset. Finally, on a clear October morning, Eleanor bid farewell to Mrs. Holbrook and the boarding house. Everything she now owned fit in 2 trunks, loaded onto a borrowed wagon alongside supplies for their new home. The cow and chickens had already been moved to Matthew's land, now their land, under their partnership agreement. As they drove north out of town, Eleanor felt a complex mixture of emotions, apprehension about potential dangers, sadness for what she had lost, but also hope for what lay ahead. She glanced at Matthew beside her on the wagon seat, his profile strong against the morning sky, and realized with sudden clarity that her feelings for him had grown far beyond those of a business partner. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. Their arrangement depended on maintaining professional boundaries, yet she found herself increasingly drawn to him, his quiet strength, his unwavering respect for her capabilities, the rare smile that transformed his serious face. "Having second thoughts?" Matthew asked, misinterpreting her prolonged silence. "No," she answered truthfully. "Just thinking about how much has changed in such a short time." He nodded. "Change isn't always bad, though this didn't come about in ways either of us would have chosen." "No," Eleanor agreed, "but perhaps it's led to something better than either of us had alone." Matthew's gaze met hers, holding for a moment longer than necessary. "I believe it has." The house looked welcoming as they approached smoke curling from the chimney where Matthew had lit a fire earlier that morning, new glass windows reflecting the sunlight. It wasn't grand or fancy, but it represented security and possibility in equal measure. Their first evening in the completed house established patterns that would serve them in the coming weeks. Eleanor arranged her few belongings in the smaller bedroom while Matthew brought in firewood and checked on the animals. They prepared a simple meal together, then sat before the fire discussing plans for the following day. Life settled into a rhythm, dawn to dusk filled with work, building corrals for the cattle they would acquire, planting a late garden that might yet produce before first frost, reinforcing the house against both weather and potential attack. They were careful to maintain propriety, each retiring to separate rooms at night, addressing each other with respect in public. Yet, something was changing between them, subtle shifts that neither acknowledged directly. Their conversations grew more personal, touches lingered longer than necessary when passing tools or dishes, and Eleanor often caught Matthew watching her with an expression that made her heart beat faster. 2 weeks after moving into the house, they received word that a small herd of cattle would be available at a good price from a drive passing nearby. It would be their first major investment as partners, utilizing most of their combined savings, but establishing them as legitimate ranchers in the territory. The night before the purchase, they sat before the fire reviewing their finances. 15 head is a good start, Matthew said, making calculations in a ledger. With proper management, we could double that by next year. Eleanor nodded, studying the figures. If we're careful with expenses through winter, we should have enough set aside for emergencies. The practical discussion of their future continued until the fire burned low. As Eleanor rose to retire for the night, Matthew caught her hand. "I haven't said it properly," he began, his voice unusually hesitant, "but I'm grateful for this partnership, Eleanor, not just for the practical advantages, but for the companionship." The sincerity in his eyes made her breath catch. "I feel the same," she admitted softly. For a moment they stood connected by their clasped hands, something unspoken passing between them. Then Matthew released her, stepping back with visible effort. "Good night, Eleanor." "Good night, Matthew." She lay awake long into the night, her thoughts tumbling between practical concerns about their ranch and the growing feelings she could no longer deny. Their partnership had begun as a business arrangement, but it was evolving into something far more complicated and potentially wonderful. The cattle purchase went smoothly the following day. By nightfall, 15 head of prime breeding stock grazed in their newly constructed corral. Standing together at the fence, watching their investment under the setting sun, Eleanor and Matthew shared a moment of quiet pride. "Our first real step as ranchers," Matthew observed. "The first of many," Eleanor agreed. As they turned toward the house, a distant movement caught Matthew's eye. He stiffened, hand moving instinctively to his revolver. "Riders coming," he said quietly. 5 of them. Eleanor's heart raced. "Blackburn?" "Can't tell yet. Get inside. Stay away from windows." She hurried to the house, pausing only to grab the rifle they kept by the door. Through the window, she watched Matthew stand his ground as the riders approached, his posture deceptively casual, though she knew he was prepared for trouble. The lead rider reined in 20 yards from the house. Jesse Blackburn, unmistakable with his distinctive red beard and the scar that cut across his left cheek. His companions spread out slightly behind him, all visibly armed. "Irwin!" Blackburn called. "Heard you've been spreading tales about me in town." Matthew's voice carried clearly through the window. "No tales, Blackburn, just facts about who burned Miss Fairfield's cabin." Blackburn laughed. "That's so? You witness it yourself?" "Didn't have to. You left plenty of evidence." The outlaw spat to one side. "Evidence don't mean much out here. But I didn't come to argue about some woman's shack." His gaze shifted to the cattle in the corral. "Nice stock you've got there. Shame if something happened to them." "State your business and move on," Matthew replied evenly. "You're not welcome here." Blackburn's expression hardened. "My business is simple. Carson wants this land and the water rights that go with it. He's willing to pay you fair price, or you can face the consequences." Eleanor's suspicions were confirmed. Carson was indeed behind Blackburn's activities. The revelation filled her with anger rather than fear. How many others had been threatened or driven off their land to satisfy Albert Carson's ambitions? "Not interested," Matthew said flatly. "This land's not for sale." "Think carefully, Irwin. Carson's offer expires today." After that, Blackburn let the threat hang in the air. "You heard me. Not for sale. Now ride out while you still can." For a tense moment, Eleanor feared Blackburn would signal his men to attack. Instead, he smiled coldly. "Your choice. Don't say I didn't warn you." He wheeled his horse around. "Come on, boys. Mr. Carson will want to hear about this." The outlaws rode away, dust rising behind them in the fading light. Eleanor released the breath she'd been holding and opened the door as Matthew returned to the house. "That confirms our suspicions about Carson," she said as he stepped inside. Matthew nodded grimly. "And tells us Blackburn will be back. That wasn't just a threat, it was a promise." They spent the evening preparing for the attack they both knew would come. Matthew checked and cleaned their firearms while Eleanor gathered essentials they might need if forced to flee. Neither spoke of the danger explicitly, yet it hung in the air between them, lending urgency to every task. As they worked, Eleanor found her mind returning to all that remained unsaid between them. If Blackburn returned with his gang, there was no guarantee either of them would survive. The thought of dying with her feelings unexpressed became suddenly unbearable. "Matthew," she said, setting aside the bundle she'd been packing, "if something happens tomorrow—" "Nothing's going to happen," he interrupted, not looking up from the rifle he was loading. "We don't know that." She moved closer, her resolve strengthening. "And I don't want to face whatever comes with regrets for things unsaid." Now he did look up, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Eleanor, I entered this partnership for practical reasons, she continued before he could stop her. But my feelings have changed. You're no longer just a business partner to me. Matthew set aside the rifle carefully. What am I to you then? Someone I've come to care for deeply. The admission felt both frightening and freeing. Someone I could love, given time. He stood slowly, closing the distance between them. I've been fighting my feelings since that first night at the line shack, he confessed. Telling myself our arrangement was too important to complicate with personal emotions. And now, she whispered, now I wonder if those personal emotions aren't the most important thing of all. His hand came up to cup her cheek, and Eleanor leaned into the touch, her eyes closing briefly at the tenderness of the gesture. When she looked up again, Matthew's face was inches from hers. May I? He asked softly. She nodded, and his lips met hers in a gentle kiss that quickly deepened, conveying months of unspoken longing. Eleanor's arms went around his neck as she responded with equal fervor, all thoughts of danger temporarily forgotten in the joy of mutual discovery. When they finally parted, both breathless, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. I've wanted to do that since I saw you sweeping your porch that day I delivered supplies last spring. Eleanor smiled. That long? That long, he confirmed, though I never imagined circumstances would bring us here. Reality intruded once more as a log shifted in the fireplace, reminding them of the danger that still loomed. Matthew stepped back reluctantly. We should finish preparing, he said, though his eyes conveyed how difficult it was to return to practical matters. Eleanor nodded. Yes. But Matthew, whatever happens, I'm glad we didn't leave this unsaid. As am I. His smile was tender. And when this is over, we'll have a longer conversation about our future. They worked late into the night, preparing defenses and planning escape routes should they become necessary. Neither mentioned altering their sleeping arrangements despite their newly acknowledged feelings. Propriety and practicality dictated maintaining separate rooms. Yet, as Eleanor retired to her bedroom, the house felt different no longer, merely shelter, but a home filled with possibility. Whatever dangers tomorrow might bring, they would face them together. Dawn broke with deceptive peacefulness, birds sang in the cottonwoods, and mist rose from the fields as the sun's first rays touched the land. Matthew and Eleanor were already awake, having slept little during the night. They shared a quiet breakfast, both hyper-aware of every sound from outside. They'll wait until full daylight, Matthew predicted. Blackburn likes an audience for his intimidation. Eleanor nodded, checking that her revolver was loaded and accessible in the pocket of her skirt. What's our strategy? Stand our ground as long as possible. If they start burning buildings, we retreat to the root cellar. It won't burn, and there's only one entrance to defend. The plan was simple but sound. They had stored water and ammunition in the cellar, creating a last redoubt if needed. As the sun climbed higher, tension mounted. Every distant sound made them freeze, listening for approaching riders. By mid-morning, the waiting had become its own form of torture. Maybe they were bluffing, Eleanor suggested without conviction. Matthew shook his head. Blackburn doesn't bluff. He's planning something. The answer came at noon, when a single rider appeared on the road from town. As the figure drew closer, they recognized Sheriff Tillman, riding hard. Matthew met him at the gate, Eleanor close behind. The sheriff dismounted quickly, his expression grim. Blackburn's gathered his gang and more besides, he announced without preamble. They're drinking at the saloon now, making no secret they plan to raid your place this afternoon. How many? Matthew asked. 12 at least, more than I can handle with my one deputy. The sheriff looked genuinely regretful. I've sent for the federal marshal, but he won't arrive for days. Eleanor exchanged glances with Matthew. 12 armed men against the two of them were impossible odds. We appreciate the warning, Matthew said. How long do we have? 3 hours, maybe less. The sheriff hesitated. Carson's in town too, holding court at the hotel, making sure everyone knows he offered to buy you out fairly. Setting up his alibi, Eleanor said bitterly. Tillman nodded. Likely so. I can't officially advise you to abandon your property, but we understand, Matthew replied. Thank you for the warning. After the sheriff departed, they faced the hardest decision yet. Staying meant likely death. Leaving meant surrendering everything they'd built together. We could go to your homestead, Matthew suggested. They've already burned it. They won't look for us there. Eleanor considered this. And then what? Hide while Carson takes our land through his hired thugs? We'd be alive to fight another day, file complaints with the territorial governor, and spend years fighting through courts while Carson profits from our water? Eleanor shook her head. There has to be another way. Matthew paced the kitchen, thinking hard. What if we set a trap, make them come to us on our terms? How? They outnumber us significantly. A slow smile spread across his face. Numbers aren't everything. Not if we're smart and they're overconfident. Over the next hour, they developed a plan that, while dangerous, offered better odds than direct confrontation or flight. They'd make the house appear abandoned, as if they'd fled upon receiving the sheriff's warning. But instead of leaving, they would conceal themselves in strategic positions around the property. Blackburn will expect to find the place deserted, Matthew explained as they prepared. They'll be careless, celebrating their easy victory. That's when we strike. Not to kill, Eleanor insisted. We need them alive to testify against Carson. Matthew agreed. We aim to wound and capture. Between the two of us, we might manage to take down enough of them to make the others surrender. It was a desperate plan with many ways to fail, but it was better than the alternatives. They worked quickly, making the house appear hastily abandoned while positioning ammunition and supplies where they would need them. As the afternoon waned, they took their positions, Matthew concealed in the barn with a clear view of the approach road, Eleanor in the root cellar, where a small window at ground level allowed her to cover the house's rear. The wait was excruciating. Every rustle of wind through grass, every bird call might herald the outlaws' arrival. Eleanor checked and rechecked her weapons, rehearsed the signals they had established, and prayed that their plan would succeed. The sun was low on the horizon when dust rose on the distant road riders approaching at a steady pace, confidence evident in their unhurried approach. Through her limited view, Eleanor counted 12 horsemen, Blackburn at their lead. The gang surrounded the house, calling out taunting challenges, clearly expecting resistance. When none came, Blackburn sent 2 men to check the building. They returned quickly, confirming it was empty. The cowards ran, Blackburn's voice carried clearly, just like Carson said they would. The outlaws dismounted, laughing and congratulating themselves on an easy victory. Several produced bottles of whiskey, already celebrating their success. Burn it all, Blackburn ordered. Carson wants nothing left standing. As 2 men approached the house with torches, Matthew gave the signal they had agreed upon, a single rifle shot into the air. The sharp crack froze the outlaws momentarily. "Blackburn!" Matthew called from his position. "You and your men are surrounded. Drop your weapons!" The outlaw leader laughed. "Nice try, Irwin. We know it's just you and the woman." "And the sheriff's posse," Matthew bluffed. 15 armed men with rifles trained on you right now." Confusion rippled through the gang. Several drew their guns, looking nervously at the surrounding buildings and trees. "You're lying!" Blackburn snarled, though doubt had entered his voice. "Am I? Sheriff Tillman's known about Carson's connection to you for weeks. He's been gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment." Matthew's voice projected confidence. "This is a trap, Blackburn, and you rode right into it." The strategy was working, creating uncertainty and division among the outlaws. 2 men at the edge of the group were already backing toward their horses. "Stand fast!" Blackburn shouted at them. "There's no posse." To prove his point, he fired wildly toward the barn. The bullet splintered wood inches from Matthew's position. That shot triggered their carefully planned response. Eleanor fired twice from her position, deliberately striking the ground near the men holding torches. Simultaneously, Matthew began shooting from different positions within the barn, creating the illusion of multiple defenders. Chaos erupted among the outlaws. Several returned fire blindly while others sought cover. 3 mounted their horses and fled immediately, unwilling to risk their lives for Blackburn's cause. Blackburn himself ducked behind the water trough, shouting encouragement and threats to his remaining men. But the carefully orchestrated crossfire from Matthew and Eleanor continued to create the impression of a much larger force. When one of Eleanor's shots caught an outlaw in the leg, dropping him with a howl of pain, the tide turned decisively. More men broke and ran, ignoring Blackburn's enraged commands to stand their ground. Within minutes, only Blackburn and 2 others remained, pinned down by what they now believed to be an overwhelming force. When Matthew called again for their surrender, offering fair treatment in return for testimony against Carson, the 2 henchmen quickly threw down their weapons. Blackburn, seeing his gang deserting him, made a desperate break for his horse. Eleanor had anticipated this. Her carefully aimed shot struck him in the shoulder, spinning him to the ground. Before he could recover, Matthew emerged from the barn, rifle trained on the fallen outlaw leader. "It's over, Blackburn," he said quietly. "Carson sold you out. The only question is whether you return the favor or take the blame alone." Blood soaking his shirt, Blackburn glared up at Matthew with hatred, but self-preservation won out over loyalty to his employer. "Carson planned it all," he spat, "paid us to clear out homesteaders blocking his water access, said no one would investigate too closely if we were careful." He laughed bitterly. "So much for careful." Sheriff Tillman arrived an hour later, summoned by one of Blackburn's fleeing men who had ridden straight to town to surrender. The sheriff was astonished to find 3 captured outlaws, including Blackburn himself, and clear evidence of Carson's involvement in the campaign of terror against homesteaders. "I never thought you'd actually pull it off," he admitted, as his deputy loaded the prisoners into a wagon. 2 against 12, those aren't odds I'd have taken." "Sometimes determination outweighs numbers," Eleanor replied, standing close to Matthew as the evening shadows lengthened across their land. That night, after the sheriff departed with his prisoners and promises of federal marshals to arrest Carson, Eleanor and Matthew sat together on their porch. The house they had defended still stood, undamaged save for a few bullet holes that would be easy to repair. Their cattle grazed peacefully in the corral, unaware of how close they had come to losing everything. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked softly, her hand finding Matthew's in the darkness. He turned to her, moonlight silvering his features. "That depends on what you want, Eleanor. Our partnership agreement still stands if that's your preference." She shook her head slowly. "I think we both know our partnership has become something more." "Much more," he agreed, bringing her hand to his lips. "I love you, Eleanor. Have for longer than I care to admit." The words sent warmth cascading through her. "I love you too, Matthew. Not just for saving me from that burning cabin, but for seeing me as an equal, for building this life with me." His free hand came up to cup her cheek. "Marry me, not for convenience or propriety, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it." "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you." Their kiss sealed the promise, tender yet passionate, filled with relief at their survival and hope for their shared future. Winter came early that year, bringing snow that blanketed their land in pristine white. By then, much had changed. Carson had been arrested and was awaiting trial, his empire crumbling as evidence of his crimes mounted. Blackburn and 2 of his men had turned state's evidence in exchange for reduced sentences, providing detailed accounts of Carson's instructions to terrorize homesteaders. The community that had once viewed Eleanor and Matthew's arrangement with suspicion now celebrated their official engagement, recognizing the courage it had taken to stand against Carson's threats. Their wedding, held in the town's small church just before Christmas, was attended by nearly everyone in the area, including Sheriff Tillman, who stood as Matthew's best man. As winter deepened, they settled into married life with easy familiarity, already accustomed to sharing work and home. The house that had begun as Matthew's project became truly theirs, filled with warmth and future plans. They would expand in the spring, adding rooms for the family they hoped to have, and invest the reward money from Blackburn's capture in additional cattle. One evening in January, as snow fell softly outside their window, Eleanor sat by the fire working on a quilt, while Matthew read aloud from a book they had received as a wedding gift. The domesticity of the scene struck her suddenly how far they had come from that terrifying night when flames consumed her cabin. "What are you thinking?" Matthew asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "About fire and smoke," she answered honestly. "About how losing everything led me to gaining so much more." He set aside the book and moved to kneel beside her chair. "I thank God every day that I overheard Blackburn's plan that night, not just because it let me warn you, but because it brought you into my life." Eleanor leaned down to kiss him gently. "From ashes to happiness. Not the path I would have chosen, but I wouldn't change where it led." Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the land they had defended together. Inside, the fire burned bright in their hearth, no longer a symbol of destruction, but of the warmth and love they had found in each other. Their story, begun in smoke and desperation, had transformed into something neither could have imagined that night: a partnership of equals, a love built on respect and courage, and a future as promising as the land they now shared. 5 years later, on a warm spring morning, Eleanor stood on the porch of their expanded ranch house, watching Matthew teach their 4-year-old son Thomas to ride his first pony. Their 2-year-old daughter Catherine played nearby, carefully arranging pebbles in patterns only she understood. The ranch had prospered beyond their early hopes. With Carson's conviction, water rights throughout the territory had been reviewed and clarified, benefiting many who had suffered under his manipulations. Matthew and Eleanor's combined property now supported a respectable herd, and their reputation for fair dealing had spread throughout the region. Eleanor's hand rested on her stomach, where a third child was just beginning to make its presence known. She hadn't told Matthew yet, saving the news for that evening's celebration of their anniversary. As Thomas successfully completed a circuit of the corral, Matthew looked up, catching Eleanor's eye across the distance. His smile, still capable of quickening her heart after all these years, spoke volumes about the life they had built from adversity. Later, as the children slept and they sat together on the porch watching the stars emerge, Eleanor shared her news. Matthew's joy was immediate and unrestrained, his embrace lifting her off her feet despite her protests about his aging back. 3 children, he marveled, setting her down gently. When I rode through the smoke that night, I was just hoping to save your life. I never imagined we'd create so many new ones together. Eleanor leaned against his shoulder, contemplating how a single moment of courage had altered both their paths forever. The best fires, she said softly, are the ones that forge rather than destroy. Matthew nodded, understanding completely, as he always did. And ours has forged something stronger than either of us could have built alone. As night deepened around their home, secure in each other's arms, they watched the distant stars and counted their blessings a love, born of danger but sustained by respect, a family growing in the safety they had created together, and a future as vast and promising as the western sky above them.